welcome to Crime and Court. My name is Heather, and this is another episode of my Wrongful Conviction Series, Innocence Lost. And today we're going to be talking about a gentleman by the name of Lukis Anderson, and he had his own DNA frame him. And we'll get more into that in just a second. Please hit the like button as we dive into a little bit more about what touch DNA is and transfer DNA. I'm going to play a TED Talk for you, which is, let me shrink myself here. We're going to watch a TED Talk together. And this woman, Ruth Morgan, talks about the prevalence of DNA that we all leave behind and how it could also be linked to a crime that we had nothing to do with. So it's a little scary that this is a possibility nowadays because science has advanced so much to the point where we can test for DNA just by, droplets in the air and things like that, where you can get like from tiny little samples, you can replicate it and you can make a stronger finding for your reports. You can, all this advanced technology that maybe it's a little bit too advanced and we haven't caught up to with the ramifications of it yet. Maybe there are people getting wrongfully convicted because of DNA too. So let's take a look or let's take a listen to what she's got to say about this.
What if I told you that forensic science isn't always the open and shut case that we might think it is? It might not surprise you if I told you that later tonight you might have left a hair, a fibre, maybe even your DNA on that seat after you've got up. But what if the person who sits on that seat next, they pick up that hair or that fibre? Ordinarily, that's not a problem. But what if they go off to commit a crime, they leave a trace of you at that crime scene, and you become the prime suspect? At this point, you might be thinking, isn't that exactly what forensic science is for? Isn't that what it does? Isn't that what we see on shows like CSI? The team follow the evidence, they identify the suspect, and then they close the case. Not all of us are going to commit a crime, but every single one of us could be accused of one.
Yep.
So imagine you're standing in the court, and the expert is explaining to the judge how that hair, that fibre, how your DNA is cast iron proof of your guilt. But you know you're innocent, but you know it's you versus science. Now, we know that there are lots of people out there who don't have to imagine this because it's happened. But the thing is, it is still happening. So how have we got here? Forensic science is undoubtedly a technological success story. We can now identify smaller and smaller traces of material. We can do it more and more accurately, and we can do it quicker than ever before. You've only got to be in this room a minute, just speaking, and the technology can pick up your DNA, maybe on that seat in front of you. But forensic science has got a problem. It's a problem that's gone under the radar, and it's a problem that has the potential to impact thousands of innocent people. In 2015, the FBI did a study. They looked at 268 cases where hair evidence was used to incriminate a suspect. And what they found was that in 257 of those cases, erroneous statements were made. That's 96%. In 96% of the cases, the forensic evidence was misinterpreted. And we've seen a similar issue for other forensic evidence types in our studies in the UK. What that 96% is telling us is that the forensic science has got a problem that technology alone can't fix. What we really need to know is that if we find your DNA on a weapon or gunshot residue on you, how did it get there? And when did it get there? And the issue is, at the moment, we don't have the data that we need to be able to answer that question sufficiently.
And that's really important. How did it get there and when did it get there? Could it have been there for 6 months before the actual person picked up the weapon and committed the crime? You don't know. And we don't have the science to tell us that. And that is a huge flaw in DNA analysis, especially when it comes to putting people's lives behind bars forever. And you don't know the who, what, when, where, why, how. You don't have all of the information. So it's hard to to put someone behind bars for without all of the information. You know what I'm saying? It's such a awful thing, and just to be accused of a crime, let alone, having been being innocent and having to deal with, like she said, it's you against science. And that PhD that's sitting on the stand that's talking about, well, there's a blah, blah, blah degree of certainty that it was the defendant right there that did the crime. But you can't say that. Like, there's so many more factors that we still need to know when it comes to these things. So it just, knowing that we have so many wrongful convictions and due to DNA analysis, it's so scary. The problem is these individuals a lot of times were put behind bars before the technology advanced to get them exonerated, but that's not always the case.
This really came home for me a number of years ago. I was working through a case file, it was a murder case, and I got to the judges summing up, and I can only really describe it to you as, that ice in the pit of your stomach moment. There was some critical forensic evidence in that case, and an assumption was made about how that evidence was transferred and when it was transferred. That was then presented to the court as a fact, and it led to the conviction of 2 men for a crime that they didn't commit. Misinterpretation of forensic evidence is the biggest challenge facing forensic science. And so that's exactly the focus of what the research team that I lead at University College London is aiming to do. We want to do those studies that will get us the data that will mean we can begin to answer these questions of how and when. So an example, we got a volunteer to fire a gun, and we got that volunteer to then shake hands with a colleague, and then
She says it really fast, so I'm going to repeat that. She got a volunteer to shoot a gun. This individual goes and shakes someone else's hands. So let me start that back a few seconds so you can hear it, because it's hard. It took me a minute to understand that. So they got originally someone fires a gun, and then that person shakes someone else's hand, and she'll tell you.
we got a volunteer to fire a gun, and we got that volunteer to then shake hands with a colleague, and then that colleague got on with his day-to-day activities. And what we observed was that that colleague not only had gunshot residue on them, he hadn't fired a gun, but he was also able to transfer that residue onto other people and onto other things. So what does that mean?
It's like secondary and tertiary transfer is possible with DNA, and who knows how much more than that. So gunshot residue showed up on the individual whose hand was shook and then or shaken, and then he went on and went about his day, and then other individuals that he interacted with throughout the day ended up with the gunshot residue on them. So it's so scary that our DNA could end up by some third party means, 3 levels in. I'm a shedder, so that's scary for me that, my hair could be on a doctor's seat or, the doctor's office. It could like fall off on the seat, and then someone after me could sit in that seat, pick up my hair, and go and commit a crime. Crazy. It could be any one of us. Any one of us.
Did anybody get a taxi here tonight? It is possible that you could now test positive for gunshot residue. It would be because you do have gunshot residue on you, but it might not be because you fired a gun recently. It could be that you happened to hail that particular taxi, you opened the door, you sat down, you got the belt, and you managed to pick up some gunshot residue that was already there. That is a very important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
We're also looking at trace DNA, how that transfers and how it moves. And our studies are showing that it is possible to identify the DNA profile of somebody who's handled a knife on that knife. Probably no great surprise. But what we are also beginning to see in our studies is that it is possible for somebody else to transfer your DNA onto a knife, but it is a knife that you have never touched.
Yep.
That is very important to know, especially if you're in the dock and you're innocent. So forensic science isn't always the open and shut case that we might think it is. It is possible that we could find your DNA on a jacket or some clothing that you've never worn. It is possible that you could test positive for gunshot residue as you go through the airport scanner because you got a taxi to the airport. But at the moment, we don't have the data that we need to understand how and when that happens. And that means that forensic science evidence isn't always going to be interpreted accurately.
The problem is a lot of times a jury might hear, oh, DNA, okay, this expert says it's that person's DNA, so sure, that must be it. But there's so many other levels of where there could be contamination or just misinterpretation of the information that you're looking at. So there are so many ways in which DNA analysis can go wrong, and we can get uh, a false response, a false um, solution. What's the answer I'm looking for? I can't think of the word, but you know what I mean. A false product. Why am I blanking on words always? Here, let's just keep playing.
So we need a change. We need a change from having our primary focus being focused on what something is and who it belongs to, and we need to get serious about getting the answers we need to the how and the when. If we can do that, we have got the opportunity to dramatically reduce the chances of evidence being misinterpreted. We need to do that so that you never have to be that innocent person in the dock. Thank you.
All right. So she answers a question, and I don't know. It's about like how she got into forensics or something, I think. So anyways, that was Ruth. What's her name? Ruth Morgan? Ruth Morgan. The Dangers of Misinterpreted Forensic Science. And that's a TED arc in the TED archive. All right, so I thought that was really good. A good way to introduce how easily it can. Whoops, I was not at the top of the screen. I wanted to do that to introduce to you how easy it can be that someone is misidentified as the person who left the DNA sample that they have, which could have been contaminated or degraded or whatever. There's tons of reasons why. All right, so we're gonna go on to, I have the trigger warning up just because this is kind of a graphic crime, but I just wanted to let people know. So this is an article. I'm on the Marshall Project website, and this is an article by Katie Worth. We're going to read. It's called Framed for Unaliving by His Own DNA. Certain words I can't say on YouTube, so I apologize. Um, so he was basically framed for taking a life by his own DNA, and we'll find out what that means here. So, when the DNA results came back, even Lucas Anderson thought that he might have committed the unaliving. I drink a lot, he remembers telling public defender Kelly Kulik as they sat in a plain interview room at the Santa Clara County, California jail. Sometimes he blacked out, so it was possible he had something or he did something that he didn't remember. Maybe I did do it, he said. Kulik shushed him. If she was going to keep her new client off DR, I can't say words, this word right here, if she was trying to get her new client off of the DR, he couldn't go around saying things like that. But she agreed it looked bad. Before he was charged with the crime, Anderson was a 26-year-old homeless alcoholic with a long rap sheet who spent his days hustling for change in downtown San Jose. The victim, Ravish Kumra, was a 66-year-old investor who lived in Montecito, a Silicon Valley enclave 10 miles and many socioeconomic rungs away. So you've got Ravish, who is living in Silicon Valley. He's kind of the epitome of money and wealth and, this lavish lifestyle. And then you've got an alcoholic who's homeless and has a drug problem or a drinking problem and struggles just to get by. And he's got a history of some crimes. He's got a little bit of a criminal history. So around midnight on November 29th, 2012, a group of men had broken into Qumra's 7,000 square foot mansion. And I just want to say 7,000 square feet for home I think is ridiculously huge. So for just for fun, I wanted to look up with you, and I don't have it. What is the largest? So the mansion in the US that has the most square feet. I looked this up because I was like, so what's a mansion? What's their square footage supposed to be? Or just, something wild. So the Biltmore Estate, which is in Asheville, North Carolina, is the largest home in the US and comes at a staggering 175,000 square feet. That is nearly 70,000 square feet more than the next biggest home on the list in the US. So that's pretty big. And so the next one would be 105 square feet, which is still ginormous. Like it just baffles my mind. I can't, my mind doesn't compute that kind of lavish lifestyle. Never had that. Sorry. Don't understand it. All right. So, anyways, a 7,000 square foot mansion. All right, so these intruders, this group of men, they found Kumra watching CNN in the living room. They tied him up, they blindfolded him, and gagged him with mustache print duct tape, which you'll see a picture of in a little bit. It's just white duct tape with little black mustaches all over the tape. So they found his companion, Harinder, asleep in an upstairs bedroom. She was hit in her mouth and tied up next to Ravish. Then they plundered the house for cash and jewelry. After the men left, Harinder, still blindfolded, felt her way to a kitchen phone and called 911. Police arrived, then an ambulance. One of the paramedics declared Ravish had lost his life or was no longer viable as a patient. So the coroner would later conclude that he had been suffocated by the mustache tape, which is awful. So 3.5 weeks later, the police arrested Anderson, Lucas Anderson, our individual that we are highlighting today. His DNA had been found on Ravish's fingernails. Okay, just think about that for a second. Think, how could his DNA get underneath Ravish's fingernails? Or on them, underneath them. However, how did it get on his nails? So they believed the men struggled as Anderson tied up his victim. They charged him with homicide. Kulik was appointed to this case. Kulik's the public defender. As they looked at the DNA results, Anderson tried to make sense of a crime that he had no memory of committing. And in this photo, where my mouse is circling, those are in pictures of Ravish's nails, the clippings. Here is a sink full of latex gloves that the intruders left in Ravish's sink. Here is a piece of the duct tape found on the ground at the crime scene. And then here is it looks like their bedroom that was basically just completely ransacked. Sad. All right, so no, I didn't do those things. He recalls telling Kulik, the public defender, but maybe I did. Lukis, shut up, Kulik says to him to get him to quiet down. Let's just hit the pause button till we work through the evidence and really see what happened. What happened, although months would pass before anyone figured it out, was that Lucas Anderson's DNA had found its way onto the fingernails of a man who was no longer alive and someone that he had never met. So, this article is really long. I want to warn you, we're not going to read all of it because it does kind of run on a little bit, but I'm going to read you some of this background because it's really interesting on DNA. So back in the 1980s, when DNA analysis or DNA forensic analysis was still in its infancy, crime labs needed a speck of bodily fluid to generate a specific profile. But that all changed in 1997 when Australian forensic scientist Roland van Oorschutz stunned the criminal justice world with a 9-paragraph paper entitled DNA Fingerprints from Fingerprints. It revealed that DNA could be detected not just from bodily fluids, but from traces left by a touch. So just by touching something, your skin cells and your sweat glands, everything, all of it, um, can leave a trace of you behind. Your DNA can be left behind. It revealed that the DNA could be detected not just by bodily fluids, but by touch. So investigators across the globe began scoring crime scenes for anything, a doorknob, a countertop, a knife handle, that a perpetrator may have tainted with incriminating touch DNA. But von Orschutz's paper also contained a vital observation. Some people's DNA appeared on things they had never touched before. In the years since, Van Orschutz's lab has been one of the few to investigate this phenomenon dubbed secondary transfer. And you might have heard a lot about this if you're following the Idaho 4 case, as the the DNA that was supposedly, and I say supposedly because I don't know if I believe the state, but the DNA supposedly was found on the knife sheath, the snap on the knife sheath, and that would be touch DNA. And um, was it primary transfer? Was it secondary transfer? We don't know, and you can't. There's no test to tell us that. So it's an interesting time in science right now where you have all this data and it's great and it's wonderful, but then you also have to be like, oh, wait, we got to stop and think a little bit before we use all of this data because there might be some things that we're missing. All right, so here's an experiment I want to explain to you that Van Oorschutz did. This is the jug experiment. So he takes a bunch of volunteers and a jug of juice in this room, and it's a sterilized room. It's forensically stable. So after 20 minutes of and it has been cleaned and wiped of all DNA before anyone goes into the room. So they let the volunteers go in. Each one of them has to take, you know, a glass, pour themselves a glass of juice and whatnot. So here's what they say. So after 20 minutes of chatting and sipping, swabs were deployed on the volunteers' hands, the chairs, the table, the jug, and the juice glasses, then tested for genetic material. That's just after 20 minutes of them sitting there chatting and drinking their juice. The jug was touched by each of the participants at least once, and each of their DNA was found on the handle in almost every case. Although the volunteers never touched each other, 1/3 wound up with another's DNA on their palm. A third of the glasses bore DNA of volunteers who did not touch or drink them. You can kind of see a breakdown here. Objects bearing DNA of a participant who never touched them. As you can see, the table has most DNA from people who weren't in the room, or I should say, who never touched the table. Okay. All right. Then there was the foreign DNA. So this is the foreign DNA, which is, look at that, 97%. The foreign DNA are the profiles that didn't match any of the juice drinkers. So this one was the participants in the room, and then this is DNA that they found of people that weren't in the room. And that's a lot, 97%, if you can't see that on the screen. I can't really make it any bigger because it like messes up the formatting on this. All right, so then The foreign DNA profiles that didn't match any of the juice drinkers turned up on about half of the chairs and glasses and all over the participants' hands and table. So you're carrying other people's DNA just by living life and being human, doing normal things. So the only explanation is that the participants unwittingly brought with them alien genes, perhaps from the lover that they kissed that morning, the stranger with whom they shared a bus grip, or the barista who handed them their late afternoon. So any number of possibilities as to whose DNA could be in the room. And I just think that this is just really a good example of what we don't know about DNA, what we can't prove about DNA. So, in a sense, this isn't surprising. We leave a trail of ourselves everywhere we go. An average person may shed upwards of 50 million skin cells a day. Attorney Aaron Murphy, author of Inside the Cell, a book about forensic DNA, has calculated that in 2 minutes, the average person sheds enough skin cells. That's just skin cells, not hair, not anything else, just your skin cells, to cover a football field in 2 minutes. That's disgusting, but that's what this forensic DNA expert says. We also spew saliva, which is packed with DNA. If we stand still and talk for 30 seconds, our DNA may be found and more than a yard away from where you're standing, which is just insane. With a forceful sneeze, it might even be further. So, just some good information. And I'm going to was that where I was going to stop? Oh, no, there's interesting stuff here too. All right, so to find out the prevalence of DNA in the world, a group of Dutch researchers tested 105 public items, escalator rails, public toilet door handles, shopping basket handles, and coins, which are all things that everybody touches throughout the day. 91% bore human DNA, sometimes from half a dozen people. Can you imagine that? Even items intimate to us, like the armpits of our shirts, can even bear other people's DNA. So, how, why, the way in which DNA spreads across a room, we don't know because we don't have scientific data to prove that yet, one way or another. So it's flawed at this point in time, I would say. All right, so this story then goes into the whole story about Lunsford, Corporal Aaron Lunsford, who took on this case, but he is the one that actually found that um, he gets the call. We had a home invasion and it turned into a 187, which was cop slang for homicide. And so he took on the case right away. He went to the Coomer mansion. I'm just trying to get through this because it's a really long article and I don't want to keep you forever. All right, so he's noticed dressers were emptied, files dumped everywhere. There was a cell phone in a toilet. A refrigerator was beeping every 10 seconds, announcing that the doors were open. Ravish's body, heavy set and disheveled, on the floor near the kitchen, his eyes still blindfolded. That's what they walked into as in the scene. This is Corporal Aaron Lunsford. So an investigation went on, obviously, into what had happened to him. He was taken to the morgue. A doctor undressed the victim, scraped and cut his fingernails for evidence. Lunsford recognized Ravish, a wealthy businessman who had once owned a share of a local concert venue. Lunsford had come to the Cumra mansion a couple times on family calls. So Lunsford, our investigator, our cop, had already been there for a couple times just for family calls that never amounted to anything, just people arguing. He had also run into Ravish at other events, buying rounds. He was like the unofficial mayor of that part of town. Ravish, the victim. All right, so in the days coming, as Lunsford interviewed people who knew the Kumras, he was told that Ravish also had relationships with sex workers. Ravish and Harinda had divorced around 2010 after more than 30 years of marriage, but they still lived together. So while Lunsford attended the autopsy, a team of gloved investigators combed the mansion. They tucked paper evidence into manila envelopes. They amassed more than 100. All right, so teams specializing in crime scene investigations were first assembled over a century ago. Oh, okay, this is where I can move on. I don't need to read all this. All right, so um, okay. Within weeks of the DNA, it's talking about other cases. It's citing other things that aren't necessary for us to read. So I'm trying to condense it a little bit. All right, so within weeks of the DNA hits, Lunsford had plenty of evidence implicating Austin and Garcia. Those were the other two individuals. Both were from Oakland, but a warrant for their cell phone records showed that they'd pinged in towers near Montessorino the night of the homicide. Police records showed that Austin belonged to a gang linked to a series of home burglaries, and most damning of all, Austin's older sister, a 32-year-old sex worker named Katrina Fritz, had been involved with Ravish for 12 years. Police had even found her phone backed up on Ravish's computer. Interesting. Eventually, she would admit that she had given her brother a map of the house. Connecting Anderson to the crime proved trickier. That's because he didn't do it. But connecting him or disproving that he was at the scene was probably even harder. All right, so there were no phone records showing that he had traveled to Montessorino that night. He wasn't associated with a gang, but one thing that he had on his rap sheet was a felony residential burglary. This is a picture of Lucas Anderson. Eventually, Lunsford found a link. A year earlier, Anderson had been locked up in the same jail as a friend of Austin's named Sean Hampton. Hampton wore an ankle monitor as a condition for his parole. It showed that 2 days before the crime, he had driven to San Jose. He had a couple of stops downtown, right near Anderson's territory. It started to crystallize for Lunsford. When Anderson was planning the break in, he wanted a local guy experienced in the burglary. So Hampton hooked him up with a jail buddy with his jail buddy Anderson. Anderson had recently landed back in jail after violating his probation, on the burglary charge. Lunsford and his boss, Sergeant Mike D'Antano, visited him there. They taped the interview. Does this guy look familiar to you? What about this lady? Lunsford said, laying out pictures of the victims on the interview room table. I don't know, man, Anderson said. Lunsford pulled out a picture of Anderson's mother. All right, what about this lady here? Do you know who she is? Lunsford said. Anderson met Lunsford's sarcasm with silence. Lunsford set down a letter from the state of California showing the database match between Anderson's DNA and the profile found on the victim's fingernails. This is starting to ring some bells, Lunsford said. My guess is you didn't think anybody was going to be home, D'Antonio said. My guess is it went way farther than you ever thought it would go. I don't know what you're talking about, sir, Anderson replied. You do. You won't look at their pictures. The only picture you looked at good was your mom. Finally, D'Antonio took a compromising tone. Lucas, Lucas, Lucas. I don't have a crystal ball to know what the truth is, only you do. And in all the years I've been doing this, I've never seen a DNA hit being wrong. So, an investigator who's probably been doing this many years, has never seen DNA go wrong. Baloney. There's actually something that all labs need to keep, which is like a decontamination or a contamination list. Anytime that they find there was a contamination in any of their testing, they have to report it. And that doesn't include times when they don't know there's a contamination, like when they might put someone away who didn't commit the crime. So Anderson had been in jail on the charge for over a month when a defense investigator dropped a stack of records on Kulik's desk. Look at them, the investigator said, now. They were Anderson's medical records. Because his unaliving charge could carry the death penalty, Kulik had the investigator pull everything pertinent to Anderson's medical history, including his mental health, in case they had to ask for leniency during sentencing. She suspected Anderson could be a good candidate for such leniency. He spent much of his childhood homeless. In early adulthood, he was diagnosed with a mental health disorder and diabetes, and he had developed a mighty alcohol addiction. One day, while drunk, he stepped off a curb and into the path of a moving truck. He survived, but his memory was never quite right again. He lost track of days, sometimes several in a row. That's not to say his life was bleak. He made friends easily, he had a coy sense of humor and dimples that shone like headlights. His buddies, many on the streets themselves, looked after him, as did some downtown shopkeepers. Kulik and her investigator had spoken to several of them. They shook their heads. Anderson might be a drunk, they said, but he wasn't an unaliver. His rap sheet seemed to agree. It was filled with petty crimes: drunk in public, riding a bike under the influence, probation violations. The one serious conviction, the residential burglary, that had caught Lunsford's attention seemed more benign upon careful reading. According to the police report, Anderson had drunkenly broken the front window of a home and tried to crawl through. The horrified residents had pushed him back out with blankets. Police found him a few minutes later standing on the sidewalk, dazed and bleeding. Though nothing had been stolen, he had been charged with a felony and pleaded no contest. His DNA was added to the state criminal database. So that makes it a little more, when you know the details of this home burglary, residential burglary, you see he might not have been trying to steal anything. He might have trying to have gotten warm, He might have just been cold. He might have I don't know how you can come up with the how do you have the ability to charge him with the intention of robbery, burglary, when he didn't burglar anything. He didn't burglarize anything. I don't know. Maybe because he kicked the window in? I don't know. All right, so his DNA was added to the state criminal database. His medical records showed that Anderson was also a regular in county hospitals. Most recently, he had arrived in an ambulance to Valley Medical Center, where he was declared inebriated nearly to the point of unconsciousness. Blood alcohol tests indicated that he had consumed the equivalent of 21 beers. He spent the night detoxing. The next morning, he was discharged, somewhat more sober. So he was probably still a little drunk. All right, so the date on the record was November 29th. If the record was right, Anderson had been in the hospital precisely as Ravish Kumra was suffocating on duct tape miles away. Kulik remembers turning to the investigator who was staring back at her. She was used to alibis being partial and difficult to prove. This one was signed by hospital staff. More than anything, she felt terrified. To know that you have a factually innocent client sitting in jail facing the DP is really scary, she later said. You don't want to screw it up. And that's a picture of Kulik, the DA, or I'm sorry, the public offender, not the DA. All right, so she knew Lunsford and the prosecutors would try to find holes. Perhaps the date on the record was wrong, or someone had stolen his ID, and there was more than one Lucas Anderson in the area. So she and the investigators systematically retraced his day. Anderson had only patchy recollections of the night in question, but they found a record that a 7-Eleven clerk called authorities at 7:54 p.m. complaining that Anderson was panhandling. He moved on before the police were able to arrive. His meanderings took him 4 blocks east to S&S Market. The clerk there told Kulik that Anderson sat down in front of the store at about 8:15 p.m., already drunk, and got drunker. A couple of hours later, he wandered into the store and collapsed in an aisle. The clerk called the authorities. The police arrived first, followed by a truck from the San Jose Fire Department. A paramedic with the fire department told Kulik he had picked up Anderson drunk so often that he knew his birthday by heart. 2 other paramedics arrived with an ambulance. They wrestled Anderson onto a stretcher and took him to the hospital. According to his medical records, he was admitted at 10:45 p.m. The doctor who treated him said that Anderson remained in bed through the night. Harinder Kumra said that the men who had taken Ravish's life, they rampaged through her house sometime between 11:30 and 1 a.m. Kulik called the district attorney's office. She wanted to meet with them and Lunsford. And then it goes on to talk about some more crimes that are related regarding touch DNA, but not necessarily in this case. So I just want to let you guys know that you're not really missing anything. But like I said, this is the Marshall Project if you do want to read this article. It's how DNA transfer framed Lucas Anderson. All right, so here in Santa Clara County, the district attorney's office reviewed the Coomer case and found that no obvious evidence of errors or improper use of tools in the crime lab. They checked if Anderson's DNA had shown up in any other cases that the lab had recently handled and inadvertently wandered into the Coomer case. It had not. So they began investigating a second theory that Ravish and Anderson somehow met in the hours or days before the homicide, at which point Anderson's DNA became caught under his fingernails. Ravish's fingernails. We are convinced that at some point, we just don't know when, in the 24, 48, or 72 hours beforehand, that their paths crossed, Deputy District Attorney Kevin Smith told the San Francisco Chronicle reporter. There now exists a small pile of studies exploring how DNA moves. If a man shakes someone's hand and then uses the restroom, could their DNA wind up on his manhood? And the answer is yes, in case you were wondering. If someone drags another person by the ankles, how often does their profile clearly show up? And of utmost relevance to Lucas Anderson, how many of us walk around with traces of other people's DNA on our fingernails? And that is 1 in 5. So, I mean, it happens. It's happening. Whether someone's DNA moves from one place to another and then is found there depends on a handful of factors: quantity, 2 transferred cells versus, okay, and then it gets all sciencey again. Um, but it depends on, the vigor of contact, how vigorously did you contact the surface, the nature of the surfaces involved, um, and the time that's elapsed between touching the item with the DNA. For instance, if you hugged someone an hour ago versus someone just now, how much of their DNA is going to be left on you? Then there's a person's shedding status. Good shedders, like people who shed hair all day, like me, shed their hair or their DNA everywhere. Poor shedders may, but this is talking about like touch DNA. So, poor shedder may move through the world virtually undetectable, genetically speaking. In general, flaky, sweaty, or diseased skin is thought to shed more DNA than healthy, arid skin, which is gross. Nail chewers, nose pickers, and habitual face touchers spread their DNA around, as do hands that haven't seen a bar of soap lately. Discarded DNA can accumulate over time, and soap helps wash it away. And some more about other cases that we're not going to read about. All right, so the traditional police work would have never steered police to Anderson, but the DNA hit led them to seek other evidence confirming his guilt. So they went and tried to find something to connect him to the other two that they had. So, like confirmation bias, you're going to be looking back into the person's um, past to find what holds them guilty to this crime. But if you're looking at it from the lens that, this isn't his DNA, somehow it got there, by, an easily explainable way, then you look for all the things that you're biased in that way. You're going to look for all the things that exculpate that person. So it just depends on your confirmation bias and how you're looking at the case. If you are an investigator, you're going to look at for things that make them guilty. So it wasn't malicious, it was a confirmation bias, like I was just saying. They got the DNA and then they made up a story to fit it. Had the case gone to trial, jurors may well have done the same. A 2008 series of oh, I don't want to talk about a series of studies. Um, Back to our case. This is all. See why I didn't want to drag you through all of this. It's not even talking about our case here. It's talking about law changing and, well, this part is interesting. I'll read this part. So in August of 2017, I guess, President Trump signed the Rapid DNA Act, which allows law enforcement to use new technology that produces DNA results in just 90 minutes. The bill had bipartisan support and received little press, but privacy advocates worry it may usher in an era of widespread stop and spit policing in which law enforcement asks anyone they stop for a DNA sample. This is already occurring in towns in Florida, Connecticut, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, according to the reporting by ProPublica. If law enforcement deems there is probable cause, they can compel someone to provide their DNA, and then they can get the results in 90 minutes. Go, oh, you're a guy. Okay, you're in prison now. Like, actual investigating of crimes doesn't need to occur anymore. It's like, oh, this guy's DNA matches because it was at the scene, even though there's a perfectly good explanation as to why that person's DNA might be there, but they don't care because they have the DNA science saying that this is them, this is your guy. All right, so it was Lunsford who figured it out in the end. So our guy Lunsford figured out what happened as far as Lucas Anderson was concerned in this case. So he was reading through Anderson's medical records and paused on the names of the ambulance paramedics who picked up Anderson from his repose on the sidewalk outside the S&S market. He had seen them before. He pulled up the Kumra's case files. Sure enough, they were the same names. 3 hours after picking up Anderson, paramedics had responded to the same two paramedics had responded to the Kumra mansion where they checked Ravish's vitals. Prosecutors, defense attorney, and police agree that somehow the paramedics must have moved Anderson's DNA from San Jose to Montessorino, Santa Clara County District. Um, sorry. The Santa Clara County District Attorney, Jeff Rosen, was postulated that, or has postulated that a pulse oximeter slipped over both patients' fingers might be the culprit. Kulik thinks it could have been their uniforms or other pieces of equipment. It could have been any of those things, but they put the pulse oximeter, the thing on your finger, and if they didn't sterilize it completely and they put it on someone else's finger, they're passing DNA back and forth to crime scenes, apparently. All right, so, well, it wasn't actually in the crime scene, it was in the ambulance, but the cops didn't know that until they investigated that. So it's crazy, huh? A spokesman for the Rural Metro Corporation, where the paramedics work, told San Francisco TV that the company had high sanitation standards regarding paramedics to change gloves and sanitize their vehicles. And then Deputy District Attorney Smith framed the incident as a freak accident. It's a small world, he told the San Francisco Chronicle. The trial against the other men implicated in the case moved forward. Austin's older sister, Fritz, testified in trials against him and Garcia. She also testified against a third man. So that's the sex worker that Ravish was involved with for 12 years. She testified against the two men who she gave the map of his home to. And there was a third man, Marcellus Drummer, whose DNA had been found on evidence from the Cumra crime scene months after the initial hits. So are we sure he is even a suspect? I don't know. He didn't find it until months later. During the trials, Harinder Kumra told jurors that she was still haunted by the image of the man who split her lip open. Every day I see that face. Every night when I sleep, when there's a noise, I think it's him. She has since then, she has sold the mansion. Members of the Kumra family declined to comment for this story. The DNA in the case did not go uncontested. Garcia's attorney argued that, like Anderson's, Garcia's DNA had arrived on the scene inadvertently, according to the attorney. Austin had come by the trap house where Garcia hung out to pick up Garcia's cousin. The cousin was in the cousin was in on the crime and had borrowed a box of gloves that Garcia frequently used, which is why Garcia's DNA was found on the gloves at the crime scene. The reason Garcia's cell phone pinged in the towers near Montserino was because his cousin had borrowed it that night. However, the cousin had lost their life within weeks of the crime and therefore wasn't questioned or investigated. That's interesting that the cousin couldn't be questioned. I don't know. All right, so jurors were now persuaded and convicted Garcia along with Drummer and Austin of homicide, robbery, and of an inhabited place and false imprisonment. False imprisonment. I get it, says Garcia attorney Christopher Givens. People hear DNA and say, "Oh, sure, you loaned your phone to someone." The jury could have had the same reaction to Anderson had his alibi not been discovered, Gibbons said. The sad thing is, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually pled to something. They probably would have offered him a deal, and he probably would have been scared enough to take it, as is the case with a lot of individuals who are charged with crimes they didn't commit. They often, Karen Reed, I fully believe, because they originally had her as manslaughter and then they upped it to second degree homicide, thinking maybe she would want a plea deal. But that woman's fighting for her life, man. She's courageous. All right, so Garcia received a sentence of 37 years to life. Drummer and Austin sentences were enhanced for gang affiliation to life without parole. Garcia and Austin have appeals pending. Uh, received uh, Fritz received a reduced sentence for her testimony, so she's still got a sentence, though, hopefully. She was released from jail after spending 4 years in custody. She got 4 years. That's not enough. All right, Lunsford received accolades for his detective work in the Coomer case and has since been promoted to sergeant. His boss, D'Antonio, is now a captain. But Lunsford says his perspective on DNA has forever changed. We shook hands and I transferred on you, you transferred on me. It happens. It's just biological. Based on interviews with prosecutors, defense lawyers, and DNA experts, Anderson's case is the clearest known case of a DNA transference implicating an innocent man. It's impossible to say how often this kind of thing happens, but law enforcement officials argue that it is well outside the norm. And if he didn't have the alibi, no one would have believed him that he wasn't there. If he didn't have the alibi from the hospital itself, he probably would have been convicted just along with everybody else in because you couldn't have proven that his DNA didn't come from the crime scene and that it came from the ambulance. You know what I'm saying? So there is no piece of evidence or science which is absolutely perfect, but DNA is the closest we have. Mr. Anderson was a very unusual situation. We haven't come across it again. No one, according to Van Oorschutz, he says um, that no one should ever rely solely on DNA evidence to judge what's going on. And that's good advice because you need to corroborate one way or another your evidence, your DNA. It is one piece of evidence, but you have to have multiple pieces of evidence to tie someone to something. So Anderson's case has altered the criminal justice system in a small but important way. A defense as defense as defense attorneys, I kept saying offense. As defense attorneys, we used to get laughed at out of the courtroom if in our closing arguments we brought this up. That was hocus pocus about transfer DNA. But now it's starting to come to light. People are starting to realize that DNA match isn't just one and done that you are the killer. That is not how we should be looking at DNA. And all of society needs to change their perspective on it, knowing that transfer DNA happens, secondary, tertiary, even, maybe even beyond that. Being accused of an unaliving was gut wrenching, according to Anderson. It pains him that he questioned his own innocence, even though he says deep down, I knew I didn't do it. After he was released, Anderson returned to the streets. As is typical in cases where people are wrongly implicated in a crime, he received no compensation for his time in jail, which is awful. There needs to be, that's your freedom being taken away. There needs to be repercussions to judges, to law enforcement, to everyone. Why are they above the law? They get special immunity all the time. Look at Judge Gull and what she's doing. She needs to be, I think charges need to be brought up against her for what she's doing because it's absolutely criminal to Richard Allen. Anyways, continuing on. Um, After he was released, he went back to the streets. He has continued to struggle with alcohol, but has stayed out of major legal trouble since. He's applying for Social Security, which could help him finally secure some housing. Anderson feels certain that he's not the only person innocent that's been locked up in jail due to transfer DNA. He considers himself blessed by God to be free, and he has advice about DNA evidence. There's more that's got to be looked at than just the DNA. You've got to dig deeper a little more, reanalyze, do everything all over again before you say this is what it is, because it may not necessarily be so. And those are the words of Lukis Anderson, who was incarcerated wrongly for several years until they were finally able to crack the case. And it is so sad. I mean, normally you think that the law enforcement is the one that's supposed to be doing all of the investigation, but really it's public defenders and it's um, private defense attorneys that are doing, they have their own investigators, for Christ's sakes. They go and do their own like investigating of these cases, which is insane. They have to do their own experiments. They have to prove, try to prove one way or the other. Can they replicate such finding, whatever the law enforcement is saying the finding is? Can you replicate it? And a lot of times the defense attorneys, they're the ones doing the hard investigating of these cases. So shout out to them. Shout out to Lunsford for, realizing the mistake and saying, oh, okay, well, this isn't our guy, so let's make sure that the wrong guy doesn't go to prison. That's kind of a start, kind of a good thing to do. You hear me, Canton? Don't let the wrong person go to prison. Delphi, all these cases that are high profile that maybe Brian Koberger, I don't know. There's so much secretive stuff going on with the FBI and results and the IgG, the touch DNA that we don't know how it got there, when it got there. So these are the things, wouldn't it be awesome if we've got like carbon dating testing? Wouldn't it be awesome if we had some kind of DNA dating? Like you could test how long that piece of DNA has been on the surface of that thing for however long. That would be the coolest futuristic um, advancement for our criminal justice system, I think. And it could help solve some of these misinterpreted or just plain out wrong cases here, these wrongfully convicted cases. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Lukis Anderson. Be sure to join me next week where we'll go through another individual. I'll highlight. Usually these are shorter, but this one had a lot to it because this had a lot of investigating going on. So yeah, be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the like, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Bye now.
If you've been impacted by a true crime and would like your story told in your own words, or if you or someone you know has been wrongfully convicted or accused of a crime, please write to crimeandcourtchannel@gmail.com and tell us your real true crime encounters. Thanks for watching.